Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Frontline Club, this wonderful bastion of journalists and refuge of free speech and the like. These seats, by the way, are incredibly comfortable. So I'm sinking back, so I'm going to be sitting like this and then falling back again. But we're here, obviously, to hear Maajid Nawaz talk about his book and biography, I guess you could call it autobiography, of the book Radical. It's a fantastic book, absolutely wonderful. I mean, I'm kind of obliged to say that, but I really do mean it.
Well, no, honestly, you're not.
Yeah, well, I will say it anyway, and I really will mean it. I mean, I've read a lot on Islamism in and around the topic, from everything from sort of theoreticians down to sort of the grassroots and stuff, and including loads of Hizb al-Tahrir material, which I tell you is really quite boring to read most of the time. But this is absolutely wonderful. I think it encapsulates for me that journey that I witnessed from talking to other people in radical movements and people including in Hizb al-Tahrir who sort of left and subsequently, and during my time in investigation, it's a wonderful, wonderful and very fascinating journey. It comes with some horrific moments, obviously, which we're going to go into.
Yeah.
But maybe I should start by saying, of course, you have a friend, Ed Hussein. I don't know, is he here tonight? You can join us?
No, he's not.
No, well, of course, he has a book.
You've just reminded me. I'm quite sad he's not here, actually.
Yeah, well, where is he? No, of course, he has a book.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the only other book you'd perhaps have it compared to. So I hope he doesn't mind you knocking him off the bestseller Islamist list.
This one may actually be Ed Hussein's Islamist on crack.
Yes, well, that's probably very great. In fact, you should have put that on the back of the book. That would have been a good way to say it. So I'm just going to explain just very briefly how this session will go. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. You'll probably get bored of me asking questions at that point, and you might have your own questions to ask, at which point, so we're going to go out to the audience, so get those sort of questions prepared. As the book is split, and then we're going to come back, we're going to have another conversation, we're going to go back out again. So it's going to be very interactive, relaxed. The book itself is split up into 3 sections. And we're going to tackle them, I guess, in that order, starting from your life in Southend in Essex, as a b-boy, sort of rapper in crazy suits and trainers and the like, and then moving on to Hizb al-Tahrir, which, if you don't know what that group is, don't worry, you will know by the end of this thoroughly what it's like, and then obviously being imprisoned in Egypt, and then finishing with, I think, where you are now, which is having left all of that behind, but in some senses not having really left it behind because you're still tackling it in the guise of the Quilliam Foundation and the like. So, can I ask you about this? You say in your book, in 2 places at the beginning and sort of towards the middle, that there's 2 objects that you still carry around with you from these sort of different parts of your life. The first is a blanket. We'll get into that later and why you have that. But it comes from your time sort of being in a car when you sort of really were at sort of perhaps one of the lowest ebbs in your life. I think you call it the loneliest part. You sort of left Hizb al-Tahrir and you sort of left your wife, your first wife at that point. But you also have a second object, which you keep still by your bedside, which is a knife. And it's not just any knife. It's a giant hunting knife, 6 inches. 6 foot would be obviously really quite giant, but 6 inches long, and it's got another knife inside it.
Yeah.
Tell me about the knife.
Whew.
Where does it come from? What does it represent? And why have you still got it?
That's a very good first question. Okay, we're going to come to the blanket afterwards, yeah? Because the blanket's a bit of a softer story. I don't want people to think I'm some psycho.
Okay, we're going to the blanket afterwards, indeed.
Okay, so I've described in the book, I tried to get across the idea of what it feels like to be the victim of violent racist attacks. We were, as I've talked about in the book, we were attacked by hammers, by screwdrivers, by kebab knives, by clubs with nails protruding from them. And
this is when you're a kid in Southend?
In Southend, in Essex, when I was 14 to 16 years old. And these were men in their 20s with shaved heads, Doc Marten boots, jumping out the back of white vans. And it was a sport for them. They called it packy bashing. So these attacks would initially happen and catch us unawares. We were completely unprepared for this. And you can imagine the terror in the heart and soul of a young 14-year-old when he's surrounded and outnumbered by burly men in their 20s with shaven heads, with big boots up to their shins, but also with weapons. And they weren't just any weapons. I mean, brutal weapons, hammers. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Michael Giddings, he's still alive and still around, but he was whacked around the head with a hammer on one occasion. He's a British Kenyan who went to school with me in Essex. So we responded in the only way, our generation, and that was at the time, obviously, as I describe in Radical, a hip-hop generation that wasn't prepared to turn the other cheek. We weren't prepared to take this lying down. We were the generation, and there's a chapter in the book, forgive me, I'm about to swear. Okay, caveat, anyone who doesn't like swear words, please close your ears. We were the fuck the police generation, and there's a chapter in the book entitled that, NWA's Track. So we weren't about to take this lying down. So what I got into the habit of, purely as an act of self-defense initially, was to strapping a knife on my back. I never used it, and I'm very happy that I've never used it. I've drawn it on skinheads, but I've never had to stab anyone, and that's probably a good thing, I think. But I've been arrested with it, I've been in police cells with it, and the book talks about false arrests by the police as well, but it would stay by my side, always. And you know, it sounds really brutal now to talk about it, but imagine everything I've just described happening on your front door. We were living on a road called Chalkle Avenue, which is opposite a park, Chalkle Park in Southend. And the incident I talk about in Radical, where the racist violence culminated and then came to an end suddenly, I won't ruin the story, but that incident was on my doorstep. These people were coming to my house, where there's my mum, my baby sister, my father. They were coming right to my doorstep. So we had absolutely nowhere to run. The police were falsely arresting us and Paki bashing and jumping out of the white vans and attacking us was the other type of white van that would shout Paki out the window in those days were the police vans. It was quite a common thing to hear racial abuse from policemen in Essex. And this is, of course, before the days of McPherson's report into institutional racism in the police forces.
After the Stephen Lawrence murder.
Yeah, so it's before the Stephen Lawrence murder, it's before institutional racism became a commonly accepted term to describe what was happening in the police forces in those days. So we felt there was no protection coming from the police, there was no protection coming from society. The only option that we had as angry young teenagers that was left to us was to arm up. And so I would carry a knife around with me everywhere I went. And so that's the knife you're referring to.
Why do you still have it, though?
So that's the question. Now to the question. I had to say that because I don't want people to think that I can be violent, but I'm not a violent person. So the reason I carry it around with me still is because I
you have it by your bedside.
Sorry.
You haven't got it strapped behind your back right now. Yeah,
it's in my drawer.
In case the questions get too difficult.
It's in my drawer next to my bed, in the desk, in the writing desk. And the reason it's still there is because I developed a perverse bond with this thing. I bought it on a school trip to the Lake District, and I bought it for protection. But I developed this perverse dependence on it. It was before I was in any way religious at all. So as I've said in Radical, I ended up relying more on this thing than even God, because it was the thing that was going to save me. And I suppose if anyone's got psychological baggage from trauma and what have you, understand that sometimes it's difficult to let things go. And I'd be happy to say, and thank you for the clarification because I don't carry it around, it's actually in my drawer. So I'd be happy to say that if the worst after everything we talk about, if the worst baggage that I've got remaining today is that I've got a knife in my drawer that I've never used and I don't carry around and I hopefully never have to use, then I'm doing okay, I think.
I'm not going to give you an opportunity to talk about the blanket yet, because that comes later, and so your soft side will remain with you for a second. But let me ask you about this, which is obviously, you talk about this generational aspect. You mentioned it now, where, in a sense, your parents' generation, my parents' generation, and similarly people of roughly our age, our parents' generation, would be the generation that would cower. They would say, well, look, we've been invited effectively in this country, or we're guests here, we won't do this. And there is this turning point in this, people of, about your age, a bit younger, a bit older, where they decide, no, we're going to fight back, and racism is being the thing, is one of the key movers in that. What did, in a sense, because you fell into a kind of this b-boy identity. How did that identity manifest? I mean, you know, and how was that important to you? Just talk a little about it.
So it might be hard to imagine now, but picture me with a bandana on my head, wearing really baggy trousers with pin tucks at the bottom. And pin tucks are when you fold the bottom of the trousers up, and then you fold them up and they become like genie trousers, and sort of they taper in at the bottom.
Like MC Hammer.
Yes, but we used to laugh at him.
Okay.
And then sort of with big fat Adidas trainers on. And so that's what a hip hop b-boy was. It was an entire phenomenon. It was a bit like, you know, you have other types of sort of these days. I think it's all about sort of what are they called? The goths and the emos and this sort of.
Yeah, I think they're also passé now. I think we're into hipsters, and I don't know where we are now. I don't know, people younger than us might be able
exposing
to
my age here. But in those days, that's what it was about. So we got into it was a culture. So it's not just the music. Rap is the music, but hip hop was the entire culture. It involved dance. In my case, sort of what we call sort of breakdancing. It involved music. It involved emceeing. It involved graffiti. It involved dressing in a certain way, it involved speaking in a certain way, and it even involved walking in a certain way, you know. So
and you were a tagger, I mean a graffiti tagger
that's right.
as well.
Yeah, so my tag was Slammer, and so the entire culture is what we got into. So the relevance of that, I suppose, in identity questions is that your generation, my generation of British Asians or generally non-white children of immigrants who were born and raised in this country, were faced with some very serious identity questions as to whether we were, in my case, whether I was Pakistani, whether I was British, whether I was English, whether I was Muslim. Some of those questions still haven't been resolved. The English question, for example, it's still something which is even a hot topic politically. Should England have its own parliament? You know, so some of those questions still haven't been resolved. But in my case, I ended up eventually settling for multiple identities. But as a teenager, I really didn't know who I was. And when experienced with that level of racism, and when witnessing what happened in Bosnia with the genocide, I began seeking to understand my own identity.
I'm going to come on.
And hip-hop formed initially a form of identity for me.
I'm going to come on to Bosnia in a second, but with your, did you despise your parents' generation for not, in effect, standing up to racism, for not, in effect, standing up and saying, look, here, we belong here, this is our country too, and, you know, you can't do this to our kids, in a sense?
I did at the time. Despise is harsh. I mean, we looked down on that attitude. Now I can understand it. If they've come, they specifically came as people to come here for work. They saw themselves as immigrants, and they were immigrants, and they wanted to keep their heads down, and they wanted to work and make something of themselves. And in many cases, they succeeded. But our generation didn't see ourselves as immigrants. We saw ourselves as entitled to the rights that everyone else was entitled to, with the same responsibilities that everyone else was responsible for, but there were obstacles in the way. And so there was a much more assertive generation that came about. And I think the hip-hop culture was crucial in developing the self-confidence needed to assert oneself, and it still is crucial. At this point, I'd like to say that political rap has it declined somewhat after those the early 90s period. It all became about gangster rap and then sort of about drugs, and I think what it is nowadays is quite commercial. But there are a small group of British MCs who are attempting to bring back the socially conscious message, because I think it's so important for, especially after the riots, for young people who are into music and what have you, to actually gain something from the music as well, and actually that the music prods them to start thinking about wider issues and not just about how big my gun is, if you like.
David Starkey might disagree with you on that point, but that's a completely different conversation. So let me just one other point of clarification, because we often think, well, if people become fundamentalists in some kind of way or radicals in a religious sense, they must have been exposed to it from a young age, but you weren't. Your family in that sense didn't send you off to any particular imam or something like that.
Not at all. No.
In fact, you're devoid.
Well, no, I had a fight with the mosque imam, because I went to the mosque and I saw this man there, and he was hitting my friends with a stick. It's one thing that the racist never did to me, he did to the other children in the mosque. So we had a big fight with him. We got kicked out of the mosque, and we never went back.
We meaning?
Me and my brother and my two cousins.
Right.
Yeah. So, and we never went back to the mosque. And my parents weren't too insistent on it either. I didn't have a religious upbringing.
So, you're mentioning about this, rap giving you self-confidence, and rap being more than just, in a sense, the music. It's the ideology. It gives you a sense of understanding of the world. HT, in a sense, Hizb ut-Tahrir. I call it Hizb ut-Tahrir. Sorry,
That's
in the book
correct.
You call
Yeah.
it, okay.
Hizb ut-Tahrir is the full name. I just abbreviated it, so
okay.
it's quite a mouthful. You see.
They also, now just explain to the audience. I don't know. Do people know what the group Hizb ut-Tahrir is? No, there's some yes and there's some no's. Why don't you explain a little bit briefly who they are?
Sure.
Not why they're important. That will come on to it, but just who they are roughly.
Right. So the Hizb ut-Tahrir is a global Islamist organization. Now, when I say the word Islamist, what matters is to understand what I mean by it, rather than, it's like 50 people say communist and they mean 50 different things by communist, but that doesn't mean communism doesn't exist. Likewise with Islamism. Islamism exists despite the differences as to what exactly it is. But what I mean by Islamism is the desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society by law. Islamists who believe in that desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society by law can either be political, they can be revolutionary, or they can be militant. So that's their methodology. They can be those who contest elections, those who want to overthrow the system via military coups, or those who use terrorism. Their methods can differ, but they all essentially agree on that basic premise, a desire to impose Islam and interpretation of Islam by law. So Hizb ut-Tahrir is an Islamist organization. It was founded in 1953 in Jerusalem, and its basic three aims are the same basic three aims of Al-Qaeda. In fact, Hizb ut-Tahrir articulated these three aims before Al-Qaeda was even conceived. And they are, one, to overthrow every single Muslim majority regime in the world. Two, to replace them with a pan-Islamist superstate. And they have appropriated the historical term caliphate to describe that state. And three, to destroy the state of Israel. These are the three core aims of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir means the party of liberation. And in terms of the three categories I mentioned...
As in Tahrir Square.
That's right, yeah.
Same word.
No relationship, same word. In terms of the three categories I mentioned, Hizb ut-Tahrir is a revolutionary Islamist organization. They don't believe in terrorism, which is why they're still legal across Europe and in America. Generally in every Western country, they're still legal because they don't blow up hotels and nightclubs and what have you. In fact, they don't believe in that. At the same time, they don't contest elections because they believe democracy is apostasy. So how do they aim to get to power? Their aim is to infiltrate the armies of Muslim majority societies, recruit army officers, as we did and as I've documented in Radical, and incite them to military coups. And so even, even this year there have been sort of two military tribunals in Pakistan and Bangladesh because army cells have been discovered who have been attempting to plan for coup plots who have belonged to Hizb ut-Tahrir. So that's the group.
You're a 15-year-old, 15, 16 in Southend when you meet Nassim? And you're dressed as you're dressed with your bandana and your knife still behind your back.
Yeah.
And you obviously don't know what Hizb ut-Tahrir is. You don't know their three aims and all of this. And that they've been conceived since 1953. But this guy approaches you and gives you a leaflet, Nassim.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that meeting changes your life entirely. But it also gives you that ideological confidence that, in a sense, being a rapper, being in that scene, had also given you, but in a much stronger way. Why?
So, keeping in mind the experience I just mentioned to you about the mosque, who was Nassim? Nassim was the man who recruited me to Hizb ut-Tahrir. He ended up becoming the leader in the UK. He ended up becoming the founder of the group in Bangladesh.
And why he was in Southend? Because
he lived there. He was like me. He was from Southend.
Yeah.
At the time, he was a medical student in Baths. Okay. So that's point number one. That is that comparing him to the mosque imam who didn't speak English, who used a stick to discipline the children, Nassim was an articulate, young, trendy and intelligent man who was studying medicine from my hometown, who could relate to me and my problems. So that was the first point to mention, that here's somebody I could understand and relate to. And what did he do? What was his narrative? Up until meeting Hizb ut-Tahrir recruiters, everything that I'd experienced, I had interpreted through the prism of race relations. And that was essentially the hip-hop prism. They would interpret all these problems because of, the civil rights struggle in America. and African Americans and their desire to emancipate themselves. It was all about race relations. And of course, me being a target of racist violence, it was natural for me to interpret everything through that same prism. Along came Nassim, now Dr. Nassim, still inside the organization, and he pushed a narrative. And the narrative was that you are a fool to think this is just about race. Now that would ordinarily be quite hard to push to somebody who's only ever been attacked by skinheads. But at the time, Bosnia was unfolding. Am I able to talk about Bosnia?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the genocide in Bosnia was unfolding. And here were white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims who were being targeted by the Serbs because of their faith, because of their religion. And we knew in those days, we were always one remove from somebody who'd gone over to fight in Bosnia with the British Army or independently. Again, this is the days before global jihadism had kicked off, and it wasn't even frowned upon to go and help people like the Bosnians against the genocide.
You described the people as returning as your own sort of Che Guevaras.
That's right, and it wasn't frowned upon. In fact, they were heroes. I personally met people that were British Army soldiers who'd converted and had encouraged others to go converted to Islam and encouraged others to go out there as well and fight the Serbs. So it wasn't frowned upon whatsoever. So interacting with these people on a daily basis through Nassim's introductions and the videos that they brought to us, they brought some really horrific videos that we, as 15, 16-year-olds who were already primed to be angry and anti-establishment, we were watching videos of really, like, I don't know if I should say it, but, you know, like women whose wombs had been cut open and their fetuses had been cut out of their bellies alive. And all of this was filmed. And trays and trays of genitalia that had been cut off Bosnian men, symbolizing the fact they didn't want them to reproduce other Muslims in that region. So this was all on video. Now, this is the days before internet. This is the days before, I think nowadays we've probably become desensitized to a lot of this because we've been watching decapitations on the internet with jihadist terrorism. But for a young 15-year-old with VHS tapes, you know, before the internet kicked off, this level of graphic indoctrination is the only word I can actually appropriately use to describe it, because they appropriated a cause and used it to push a narrative. And that narrative was that this isn't about race. This is a war against Islam, and the Muslims are under siege everywhere. And whether it's in Bosnia or in Kashmir or in Palestine or in Chechnya, the question that was posed to me is, whether in the streets of Essex or in Palestine, why is it that it's only Muslims who are being targeted and killed? Now, of course, that's not true. But being a young, angry 15, 16-year-old who didn't know much about world politics at the time, you know, it resonated. And it resonated both with my anger and with what seemed to be the facts playing out on the ground. And so the narrative was pushed that, look, this is, you are naive to think that it would stop at just race. If you were white and blonde-haired and blue-eyed, you could still be and would still be attacked in Britain because you're a Muslim. And so this is a war against Islam. And if it's a war against Islam, the only appropriate response is to stand up and defend Islam and Muslims. Now, that gives you one of two actions, two courses of action. One is to pick up arms and take matters into your own hands. Hizb al-Tahrir don't believe in that. So the narrative was then, if you did that, fine, it's a good thing to do, but you would be inefficient. Why not do something more efficient? Why not have your own army? Why not create your own state? How do you think Islam even got to Bosnia in the first place? The Ottoman Empire, the last bastion of this caliphate, this grand superstate that protected Muslims from all over the world, brought Islam to Bosnia. If we could recreate that state, then our armies would protect Muslims across the world, just as the American army protects American citizens. And so what we really need to do to stop the genocide in Bosnia is re-establish this caliphate. That narrative, to somebody who was a very, very angry, disconnected, disenfranchised young 15-year-old, was extremely attractive. Because Islamism in those days was what communism was to Che Guevara's generation. It was the ideology of resistance. And so we adopted this, and it became an identity, it became a cause, and it became a resistance.
And we're going to get to questions in a second, so be prepared.
One of the 2 sessions, yeah? Questions, yeah.
But let me ask you this as well, which is that in that respect, what they're offering here is to say, look, you're Muslim, which is now different from you being, let's say, Pakistani, which is somewhat narrower, or an ethnic minority, or British. this is a global identity in a soon to be globalized era in many senses. And does that make you, and does that appeal work not just for you but for other people around you?
Yeah, absolutely.
To be part of 1.3 billion people is a nice subset to be a part of.
Yeah, because if you're experiencing that level of disconnect from your own society, and you're looking for an identity and a sense of belonging, you can either join the Pakistan Club, which in those days was our parents' generation, which is not a particularly trendy club to join, yeah, or you can join this global, powerful, self-assertive Muslim identity. Now, I won't ruin it for the readers of those of you who do buy the book. By the way, I highly encourage you to buy the book. But the level of power and seeing results that came immediately as a result of me adopting this identity is summarized in the chapter called the Green Rucksack with No Bomb. If you read that chapter, you see what happened as a result of us adopting this identity and how we managed to face down so many of the conflicts and violence that we were exposed to on the streets of Essex. So it gave us this club idea that you've mentioned. We immediately we had backup. Suddenly we were members of this internationally feared and renowned club called the Muslim Ummah, or the global Muslim community, who were just about beginning to hit the headlines with Palestinian terrorism and hijacking aeroplanes. People were just about realizing that these guys are prepared to do things that others aren't prepared to do.
Do we have any hands as yet? Yes, we do. One gentleman over there in the back.
John Boyle, I'm from Reuters. My question is, you mentioned earlier your friend you said I think was of Kenyan origin, and I'm assuming he wasn't Muslim. Is that correct?
Well, he ended up sort of through our advice becoming a Muslim. Yeah.
Okay. Well, my question was, when HT started coming to you and giving you this narrative of, it's Islam, my friend, why didn't the experience of your black friend who was being attacked along with you not stop you, make you think, hang on, no, that's not true, it's not just that, there's something else going on there?
See, of course, this narrative doesn't discount the existence of racism. What it does is say that it's not just racism, that if it was just racism, then Bosnia wouldn't have happened. So the narrative is inclusive in that perverse sense, that it can cater for racism as being a factor as well. But then even more so, the answer would have been from Nassim, well, yeah, even more so, you'll be attacked because of your skin color as well as your faith. And that's even more reason to defend yourself in a way that's efficient and to defend your people. And then the other answer that kicks in there is it's selective reading of history, but it has some basis in historical fact. And to a young 16-year-old sounds very attractive. And that was, if you consider the historical record of the Caliphate, there wasn't one caliphate, that's important to mention, of any given caliphate and the various competing empires that essentially were empires using the name caliphate. But if you consider their historical record, in the medieval era, the region that was particularly tolerant to other ethnicities and religious minorities was the Muslim region. When the Spanish Inquisition was going on, when Europe was in its dark ages, the Muslim empires were the ones who were allowing other faiths to explore and investigate maths and science, and it was a multi-ethnic faith. So the Hizb ut-Tahrir recruiters were able to draw on that and say that even the problem of racism is solved by having this sort of by having this caliphate.
Maajid.
We're at the back there. Okay.
Oh, we're at the back. Okay.
Could you introduce yourself as well, please?
Julian West. Just from the point of view of how things are now, I mean, how much of it right now, sort of 10 years after 9/11, I mean, how much do you think the appeal of this sort of Muslim identity has to young Muslims now?
Yeah.
Because a few years ago it was very strong, but I'm just wondering right now.
Yeah. I agree, a few years ago it was very strong. I'm wondering whether it's as strong now. I would err on the side of caution and say it is. But just for everyone else, I need to explain something here. I don't believe there's anything wrong with somebody asserting their Muslimness. I think the problem is when it becomes exclusive. So I'm sitting here in front of you all. I'm a father. I'm a man. I was a husband. I'm not anymore. My professional identity is also there. I'm British. I'm Pakistani. I'm an Essex boy, born and raised. I have multiple identities. That's the point I'm trying to make. The Islamists, what they did is they excluded all of those other identities and said the only thing you are is a Muslim. whether in religion or in politics. So when you engage in politics, you're not a member of the Lib Dems. Oh, that's one I forgot. I'm a member of the Lib Dems. When you engage in politics...
You are?
Yes, I am, sorry.
Was that in the book? I don't know.
That's the last pages you didn't get to.
Oh, right, I didn't get it. Oh, right, yeah.
By the way, everyone, my interviewer here has not read the last 10 pages of the book. So
yes, I've been
he's
totally
abysmally failed.
I didn't want to give away the
Which is why he was
ending.
so surprised there.
Yeah.
That isn't the ending, okay? It doesn't end on announcing that...
And then I'm a member of the Lib Dems. That would be somewhat disappointing after 350 pages to read that as a conclusion.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So that's one of my identities. And the Islamists, what they'd insist on is that you're a Muslim in religion, and when engaging in politics, you are nothing but a Muslim. Now, of course, what that implies is there's only one correct answer in politics, and that's the Islamic answer. And then what that, in turn, the consequence of that is that pluralism is absolutely frowned upon. Dissent is frowned upon as well, and in fact, in many cases, is stifled. And when Islamists come to power, we know what they do with dissent. So that form of Muslim identity, what I call it is the exclusively Muslim identity in politics, insisting there's only one way of doing politics, and that's the so-called Islamic way. That is unhealthy, that form of identity. What isn't unhealthy is to assert one's religious identity, whatever it may be. So now, in answer to your question, is that unhealthy form of Muslim identity exclusively in politics still quite prevalent? I think in a non-terrorist way it is, and I'm worried about it because I still think, as I've spoken about in Radical, that we are living together apart in this country. We are living in cities that are self-segregating. There's no official policy of segregation in Britain, and it's not even encouraged, but it exists, and it's there. And in many cases, it's self-segregating, meaning both communities, respectively, just don't want to mix with what they define as the other. And I think it's very unhealthy.
One final question. We've got another question session coming up, but just one final question from the front here.
Okay.
Want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Hadani Ditmar's author of Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, A Woman's Journey Through Iraq, and oddly enough, currently writing freelance for Haaretz. And I have sort of a twofold question. First of all, I think I'm not the only one that read the debate with Mehdi Hassan. And
you ruined my last question.
Well,
it's fine.
We'll get to it quickly. So he seemed to be saying that basically terrorism happens because of foreign policy, and he backed that up with the quote from the CIA officer, former CIA officer. So I'd just like to get your comment on that. And at points we were sort of agreeing with each other, so I don't know if you think you won the debate or he did, but I was just interested if you could comment on that particular thing. Also, it struck me as I was reading about you and your life in Essex in those days that there were some interesting parallels with interviews I've done with former Black Panthers. I have a friend whose father was one of the founders in Oakland, but I'm wondering if you were influenced at any point by, I don't know, have you read Elridge Cleaver? Do you think there's any parallels there in terms of, the black man being dangerous when he's armed, but the white militiaman maybe being less threatening, if there's some parallel in Britain with the BNP and the sort of terror threat, quote unquote. So yeah, those are my two questions.
Could you answer the second one? Well. And the first one we'll leave to the end because there's lots of stuff to be discussed at that point as well.
But I would like to answer that first one because it's a great question. So
okay.
As long as you come back to that and the blanket.
I've got it. And the blanket. I've got them, they're both written down here for endpoints. Yes.
Okay. Yes, my influences were Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Public Enemy was the rap group that I was most sort of into. Fear of a Black Planet is the album, and Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. The album before that were the two that I was a huge fan of. And Brand Nubian is another hip hop group that was contemporary at the time, and they were using 5%, which is another sect, a black nationalist Muslim sect within the States. These were heavy music influences in the early 90s hip hop, and they would sample people like Malcolm X's speeches. So this had a huge influence on the identity questions that I was facing. I've mentioned all this in Radical. I've also said that I consider these groups racist. Just to make that point very clear, the Nation of Islam and 5% are racist organizations, and I came to the same conclusions that Malcolm X came to when he left such organizations. In fact, I end Radical, the epilogue, with Malcolm X's quote when he says that he returns from the pilgrimage in Mecca, and reflects upon the hatred and wants to try and deal with some of that hatred. So I need to make it very clear that I do think these groups are racist, but they did have one positive impact. And that positive influence was the idea of ending the victimhood narrative. So whether it's Dr. Martin Luther King's civil rights activism or even Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, one resoundingly clear message they took to African Americans was that instead of blaming society for your ills and then using that blame as a justification for your addiction to drugs or your involvement in crime or black on black crime even, stand up for yourselves. The Nation of Islam, for example, would insist on their members dressing smart. Have a level of self-respect and don't see yourselves as victims, but see yourselves as people that can turn adversity into opportunity. That also had a profound impact on the latter part of my life, reflecting on that message. Meaning, what do I mean by that? Meaning now, and this links to your first question, but I won't answer it because I don't want to spoil it for Shiv. But now, sadly, so many British Muslims and European Muslims and Western Muslims in general, and Muslims across the world even, let's say, so many, for so many, the victimhood narrative has become popular. And it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Yes, we as Muslims have suffered from foreign policy grievances. Yes, we've suffered from racism in my case, from torture in my case as well. You know, I'm a product of that victimhood narrative. I am a pure product of those grievances. Everything I am is I've gone through every single grievance you can think of. But we've got to stop blaming everything else on our own faults. We have faults too. But that I won't go on because that links to this other question you've asked about the debate I had with Mahdi Hassan, and I think we'll get to that properly. So the self-respect and the sort of the shedding the victimhood mentality is a positive aspect that I took from the Nation of Islam narrative.
But Black Panthers you consider racist as well? Or just Nation of Islam?
Well, I know less about them. I am a supporter of the Free Mumia Abu Jamal campaign because I think that there's a disproportionate amount of African Americans on death row, and I think that in his case in particular, there's been a miscarriage of justice, and I don't believe in the death penalty anyway. So even if he was guilty, I don't think he should be executed, and I do support the campaign for his release. And for those of you who don't know, he's on death row in the States. He's the founder of the Black Panthers movement, and he's on death row. He was tried and convicted by an all-white jury, interestingly.
Let's go back now to, you're still a late teenager now, and just explain a little bit, because again, you know, we often hear about the aims or perhaps how dangerous or not dangerous Hizb al-Tahrir is, but you know, it's also, these groups are like having any kind of other relationship, right? You get wooed at first, and then it becomes a bit boring, and you have to go to study circles, and then maybe a bit, or is it a bit cult-like? I mean, what is it like? And you have to do a lot of work, you know, you have to go out and recruit people, and you know, do all this reading and stuff like that. What, you know, what's the day in, day out drudgery like? I mean, if it is drudgery, or was it exciting all the way?
Well, see, you've read most of this, so you'd know that basically what I did was a bit different. So I think for most activists it was probably boring, but I tried to always push the boat out because I would have got bored otherwise, and it's the sort of person I am. So I tried to always use the ideas and the recruits to take it to that next level. And that's why I ended up by the age of 24 having co-founded the group in 4 different countries. So that isn't boring because you're traveling and you know, you're meeting new people.
And they subsidized your flights. I mean, it sounds quite, in some sense, it's quite glamorous.
Yeah, I honestly felt like an international revolutionary. You know, I felt like as I said, we were our very own Che Guevaras. We were running around the world. I mean, in there I document whether it's in Britain recruiting Pakistani army officers from Sandhurst and then sending them back to Pakistan to engage in a military coup attempt. They were arrested in 2003 by Musharraf. Or it's going to Denmark and founding the Danish-Pakistani branch of Hizb al-Tahrir in Denmark to then encourage Danish Pakistanis to go back and incite a coup in Pakistan. Or whether it's arriving in Egypt one day before the 9/11 attacks and ending up as the head of the Alexandria chapter of this group in Egypt. Or it's being on the leadership in Britain and you know, taking over all the student campuses. So in my case, it wasn't boring, interesting, but I agree that for most of the members, it could have got quite boring, and a lot of members did, you know, we had a high turnover. What I'm more surprised at is that those members who joined during the heyday of what, I'm not a fan of Melanie Phillips, but Londonistan is a nice way of describing what happened to London in those days. The Islamicization of Britain and the policy, the active policy of the British government to encourage Islamist asylum seekers to fundraise for jihadist terrorism in Britain because they were viewed as a foreign policy asset, led to the Islamicization of Britain. And in that heyday, there were people that joined, understandably, they got caught up in it. I'm surprised that they stayed in, because Islamism as an ideology has taken such a bashing and a battering. I'm surprised that, you know, intelligent men and women who are, for all other thoughts and purposes, you know, they think for themselves, they're doctors, they're engineers and stuff, and they stayed inside this organization. So I wonder why they're not bored.
And HT also like to recruit those sort of doctors and engineers things,
Yeah.
but you almost, because they kind of like the cachet almost, it seemed, and those were the right people to influence, because they would be the right people to influence other people
like
in society.
like anarchism, actually all extremism, all ideological extremism, whether it's militant socialism, communism, Islamism, anarchism, it's a product of the middle classes experiencing, in one shape or other, a form of identity crisis. Anarchism began in the engineering colleges of Europe. Communism was a middle class phenomenon. It's the case. It's usually the case.
You say in your book, you sort of always manage to sort of scrape out of situations where you're about to be beaten, but there's also the inverse, where you don't also get involved directly in violence. You never use that knife, for example. But there's a situation in the book, and to those who know their kind of Islamist history, this is quite a central, seminal moment in some respects, which is when this young African kid called Tundi, I forget his second name.
That's his second name.
Yeah.
Tundi Obono, that's his full name, yeah.
And he was known as Tundi, that was his nickname. In Newham College, gets stabbed to death. And this is what, 1990?
Would have been 1995.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that you were the guy next to the guy who plunged the first knife in. Explain that moment and how that happened, because this happened just after, you know, Omar Bakri came to the college, and
so I
ramping up.
I've described this in the book as the most despicable phase of my life. I think it was the lowest I reached in terms of morals and etiquette and behavior, because Said Noor, the man eventually convicted for the murder of Tundi Obono, who was a Nigerian student in the East Ham campus of Newham College, and who was carrying knives himself. He was quite a violent man, but he didn't deserve to be murdered. Now, Said Noor murdered him. Said Noor was on that campus as on our invite, as he self-appointed himself as our bodyguard. I was president of the Students' Union in Newham College at the time. My entire Students' Union committee was composed of Hizb al-Tahrir activists. We stood on a slate and we were all elected together, and we took over the Student Union. One of the reasons we did that is because the Islamic Society at the time was controlled by our rivals, and they were the Salafists, who we despised. And Dr. Osama Hassan is here. He's one of the founding members of JIMAS, also has had a journey. He's now a leading reformist for Muslim religious thought. He was on the other end. He was our enemy, and we were his enemy. And so the JIMAS people, the Salafists, were controlling the ISOC, and we needed to take that over. So we went for the Student Union instead, and we won. So Said Noor came into that campus and into that atmosphere and appointed himself as our bodyguard. And he would carry a knife around, a sword, should I say, and he called it Abdul Jabbar. Anyone who understands Arabic will know that Abdul Jabbar means servant of the compeller. And Al-Jabbar is one of the names of God from the 99 names, and it means the compeller. So he named his samurai sword the servant of the compeller. And the Nigerian students on that campus up until that point had got used to bullying the Pakistani students. Now, of course, for us it wasn't a racial thing. There are Nigerian Muslims. 60% of Nigeria is Muslim. But so we saw this as a Muslim versus non-Muslim thing, not as a racial thing.
This is how far your kind of rap identity completely moved on now.
Moved on,
4 years
moved
later.
on. Whereas 2 years prior to that, I would have had a sense of solidarity with a British African. Now they were my enemy if they weren't Muslims. And so we began rallying the Pakistani students there around sort of the heady call of Islamism and attempting them to begin defending themselves. And one of the ways in which we did that was by standing up to these bullies on campus. And Said Noor, matters came to a head, and to cut a long story short, ended up plunging Abdul Jabbar, his samurai, through Tundi Obono's heart. And when he did this, a whole bunch of other young students, British Pakistanis, came also with hammers and knives and jumped on Tundi Obono and they murdered him. I think 3 in total were convicted for the murder, including Said Noor. As president of the Students' Union, I was in charge, and instead of trying to stop this, though I didn't incite the murder directly, what I did incite was an atmosphere in the college that could have allowed for such an act to occur. At the time of the murder, I was standing right next to Said Noor, and my hand was on my knife, which was still strapped to my back. And then something happened, which I won't say, because you have to read the book. But
buy the book.
Buy the book and read it, yeah. So something happened that stopped me drawing my knife right there and then. I'd unclipped it. My hand was, so if it's tied behind my back, my hand was actually up my shirt. I'd unclipped the button. I was about to pull it out, and something happened that stopped me. And that something is something that reoccurred at a different stage of my life and was crucial to the rehumanization process that I eventually went through. So something stopped me pulling the knife. And Said Noor, and the difference right there and then was that Said Noor was convicted for murder, and I never was even charged for any crime because I didn't draw my knife. But it was literally a split-second decision that saved me from, for spending a life in prison.
Yeah, and one of the guys there was a guy called Qazi Nuruddin
That's right.
Rahman, who was later then convicted. I mean, he's right there on that playground, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I
He was
mean,
one of the people that we were
sixth form college,
radicalizing. He was then released he wasn't convicted for the murder. He was then charged separately because later on, in a sting operation, he was found attempting to buy a rocket-propelled grenade
grenades,
launcher.
all sorts of ammunition and stuff in
yeah.
an MI5 Stinger in 2006 or something.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's skip forward. You described that well of kind of, leading this kind of very strange jet-setting life on behalf of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And then they send you, after going to Pakistan, to Denmark, you get married at this point as well, and you have a child with your wife. And nevertheless, you're sort of still living the revolutionary life. You can see that it's putting strains on that relationship. And then you're also enrolled in SOAS and attempting to do a degree, and amongst all of this and taking a year out to go to Pakistan, you end up in Egypt to study a year doing Arabic, but also to actually, start cells up for Hizb ut-Tahrir in Egypt, which obviously one of these, big important countries in Hizb ut-Tahrir's strategic plan, along with Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons. Egypt is kind of, maybe one of the few on the top list of, countries to hit. You're warned by a friend of yours who is arrested and tortured and let go. He gets a message to you that you're being watched while you're there, and he warns you. And the warning is basically, pretty much you should leave. Would be any sort of reasonable response. You're going to get tortured by Egypt's secret police. This surely isn't going to be, fun. Why didn't you leave at that point? And you remember, you have a wife there and you have a child. Why didn't you just leave?
So at this stage, I'd just like to say, has anyone studied law here? No one studied law? Oh, there's one hand out there. So imagine trying to study law at university and do everything he just said, which is what was going on. So
it's law and Arabic.
Law and Arabic combined, yeah. So it did have, the reason I mention this, it had huge strains on my marriage because I was both trying to study, set up Hizb ut-Tahrir in 4 different countries, and be a father to my child and be a husband to my then wife. So the strains on the marriage began early on, before I even considered even the possibility of ever leaving Hizb ut-Tahrir, let alone Islamism. In Egypt, partly due to the strain on the marriage, my wife and I decided that I'd stay there alone and she would return to Britain because she needed help raising my son. So she came back. And it was during the time that she'd left the country that all of this began happening. This man was a medical student who I tried to recruit in Alexandria University. And he was tortured because of me. He was picked up, they electrocuted him all over his body, and they interrogated him and said, we want you to tell us everything about Maajid Nawaz, because we know he's in this country to set up Hizb ut-Tahrir and attempt to overthrow the Egyptian government. Now, allow me to pause here and just say that Egypt has a particularly sensitive history with my former group. Because in 1974, a member of Hizb al-Tahrir named Saleh al-Sarriya attempted what's known as a military academy case. It was an attempted coup that went bad, and in Egypt's military academy, Qadiyya al-Fanniya al-Askariya is what it's known as in Arabic, there was bloodshed. And many army cadets and officers were killed in this attempted takeover by Hizb al-Tahrir members. From 74, Hizb al-Tahrir was never again tolerated in Egypt. And then, in 79, another member of Hizb al-Tahrir by the name of Salim al-Rahal went to Alexandria and established a group, and he changed the name. And the reason he changed the name is because he needed to evade detection due to what had happened with Hizb al-Tahrir in the military academy case. So he needed to avoid the security services catching on to what he was doing. So he created a new group called Tanzim al-Jihad, founded in 79 in Alexandria by a member of Hizb al-Tahrir called Salim Rahal. Tanzim al-Jihad went on in 1981 to assassinate the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat. It went on to split into two groups, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, which is was the larger terrorist organization in Egypt, and Al-Jihad al-Islami, the smaller one. Anyone who knows their communist history will recognize this as the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, along a similar sort of schism. Should we be populist or should we be ideologically pure and doctrinaire? So the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya were the populists and the Jihad al-Islami were the doctrinaire people. Jihad al-Islami was headed by a man then, a young medical student named Ayman al-Zawahiri. So this is the effect that Hizb al-Tahrir has had on the history of Islamism. And this is why Egypt was so sensitive to Hizb al-Tahrir rearing its head ever again in Egypt. Because they practically led to the death of their president, Anwar Sadat. So when we went in 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, and they realized that there's a guy who had gone to Pakistan and co-founded the group in Pakistan, and he's now in Alexandria, exactly where Tanzim al-Jihad was started, attempting to resurrect this group, they saw red. The alarm bells began ringing for them. And so they got hold of this guy that I tried to recruit, and they tortured him for everything he knew. But there's something about the courage of somebody who risks his own life to send his friends to warn me that he's being tortured and risk the life of his family, because it was not unknown for Egypt's state security, known as Amin ad-Dawla, to not only torture the suspect, but to torture their children, and to torture their fathers, and to torture their grandfathers. I've seen this with my own eyes in prison. They would torture a grandfather to force the grandson to confess. So the sheer scale of what this man risked to get this warning to me is something which we probably can't imagine. But he got a warning to me that he'd been tortured based upon their knowledge that I was in the country and that I should leave as soon as I can. There was a bit of a cat and mouse chase, which I won't go into. So why didn't I leave? Ever the rationalist, I decided that it was...
Maybe we should leave it at that, ever the rationalist.
I decided that it would be self-defeating to attempt to leave, because of course, if I try and leave from the airport using my passport and they already have my name, they can just arrest me at the airport. So instead what I tried to do is hide inside the country. And so that's the reason I didn't try and leave, because to exit from any port of entry or exit from Egypt would mean using my passport, which would flag up on their system, and they'd descend upon me immediately and arrest me.
Okay. How long have we got? Have we got another 15 minutes? Maybe longer? Excellent. Can you read that passage that we discussed, 233?
Sure.
So I'll just set it up, which is to say, so you do get arrested eventually. After 6 months of this, they suddenly, one night, arrive at your house. Your son is ripped from your arms. You get barely a few minutes to say goodbye to your wife, and you're dragged off. You notice that you've been arrested along with some other of your associates, people who you haven't even necessarily recruited, but people you've lived alongside, including one Japanese guy. They're all detained with you, and this is going horribly wrong, and you're sort of taken off in a van, and you described all this incredibly powerfully. And then there's this moment where basically you're in Go on, you want to explain the rest of it? Where are you
We're
now?
in a building known as Al-Ghaz, which is the underground torture facilities of the Egyptian state security. It was, if anyone remembers, if you follow the Egypt uprisings, this building Al-Ghaz was eventually raided by the revolutionaries in Egypt.
It was gutted out.
It was gutted.
Burned,
they stormed it because it was a symbol of tyranny and oppression and brutal torture, and it was feared. This building was feared throughout Egypt. It was the headquarters of the state security. So we couldn't have been taken to a worse place than this, to be honest. The passage you've selected is the beginning of chapter 20, and it's called Assalamu alaikum, you've just come out of hell, because that's what Al-Ghaz was. It was a living dungeon. It's a very difficult passage, so bear with me while I try and read this. It was very difficult to write this as well, because it meant excavating these memories. But it's me describing, I was numbered, we were all given numbers. My number was 42, and everyone in the torture dungeons was tortured one by one in chronological order. So as number 42, I was forced to listen to 41 people before me tortured by electrocution. And then my number, eventually on the third day, my number 42 was called. So this chapter begins with the passage of me attempting to describe in words what it feels like once your number's been called, knowing what's going to happen next. It was very difficult to describe in words, and I remember when I wrote this, I actually broke down. So I hope it goes some way in explaining what it feels like to have to be to walk to your own torture. So this is, as I said, it's the chapter. Don't worry, the book ends well, everyone. So,
with you joining the Lib Dems. So.
Yeah, indeed. So this is from the chapter Assalamu alaikum, you've just come out of hell. To be asked to voluntarily walk towards your own torture is the cruelest of expectations. Why can't they just carry me? Each step is a personal betrayal. My body is convulsing in revulsion against my commands. Every instinct is screaming at me to turn the other way, but I'm expected to walk on. Try standing in the middle of a highway, watching an oncoming bus without flinching. That's hard. Now try voluntarily walking towards that bus instead of stepping out of the way. Impossible. My legs are buckling under each step, but I force compliance and walk on. God, your chaperoning hand that helps me walk blindly towards my own torture feels perversely merciful. For how could I avoid stepping on my brothers in the corridor were it not for you? Alas, without sight I cannot help but feel so disgustingly dependent on you. Now it is hard to breathe. Fighting to stay hidden away deep within me, even my breath fears coming out to face my torturer. My heart is attempting to escape the cage that is my chest, and my mind is beginning to shut down. I'm in shock. Ya Allah, oh God, I need you right now. If any mercy I have ever shown to anyone has amounted to any value in your esteem, then send me your angels now to shield me from these monsters. I'm trying to be brave for you, my Lord, but the truth is I'm scared. Help me, my Lord, for I am very scared.
Thank you. Going to leave what happened there for people to read themselves, what happened in Egypt, your incarceration, and I'm going to try and head out to questions as soon as possible. But let me just ask you maybe one or two other things. Obviously you left. Again, I'm going to leave that, the reasons why you leave Hizb al-Tahrir, it's absolutely fascinating. If the audience wants to ask about that, then they can. So let me ask you about the blanket.
Yes. So,
I mean, this is also, I'm making this very depressing as well, because it's also quite a low point, but, you know.
So when I was released from prison in 2006, you can imagine, waiting in prison for 4 years, including in solitary confinement. We were put into solitary confinement after we were taken out of the torture dungeons. And one of the things that really helped me get through this period was the thought that I'd be reunited with my son and my wife, my then wife, who I've got to say, despite everything, did a fantastic job to support me during that time. And I owe her that for the rest of my life. So when I was released, of course, by this time, we've skipped a whole section of how my views began changing. And when I came back to Britain, it took me another 10 months or so on the leadership of Hizb al-Tahrir in Britain before I realized that I could no longer continue, not just as a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, but as an Islamist. I no longer believed in the Islamist ideology. In fact, I'd come to believe that the Islamist ideology was one of the obstacles that was preventing the progress of British Muslims, as well as racism, as well as all the other grievances. Islamism was right up there in the top 10 as one of the major obstacles preventing the progress of Muslims in this country and the West and the world generally. It was a stifling, totalitarian, victimhood ideology that prevented independent thought, and all it ever did was breed more extremism, more discrimination, more racism, and more division. So Nassim, by this time, was leader of the group in the country. He needed to go to Bangladesh to set up the group there, and wanted me to take over as what they called the Mu'tamad, or the leader of the group in Britain. So I was forced to make a decision, and I made the decision to unilaterally resign from Hizb ut-Tahrir, and then made the decision that somebody who was always driven by a sense of injustice and a desire to set things right, now recognizing that Islamism was one major source of injustice among the many others, I was driven by the same sense of injustice and had no choice really but to do something about it. Because one thing that's important to understand is I'm the same person. I'm the same person as I was when I was 15 and 16, when I was, and also when I was with Hizb ut-Tahrir, and as I am now. I just can't stand by. I don't like standing by and watching people suffer. And in the book, I talk about how I speak to people who are about to go and be tortured, and I try and console them and advise them. I just don't like seeing people go through strife. So when I realized that Islamism is causing more suffering than most other things in the Muslim majority societies in terms of political thought, I wanted to try and challenge it and put it back in its box. So leaving Hizb ut-Tahrir would have been one thing. I don't think it would have had as many negative connotations. But standing out there and to try and challenge not just Hizb ut-Tahrir but the Islamist ideology is what led to the negative consequences for me in my personal life. And that was that inevitably my then wife was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and inevitably she didn't agree with my change. But not only did she not agree, to make matters worse, in Pakistan I'd recruited members from her family. Some of those had gone on to be tortured. One of them had had his spine dislocated, and these were people I recruited to the group. So there was a lot of emotion and resentment there when I left. And that led to the dissolution of my marriage, almost within the year of my return from prison. And it led to me having to leave my flat that I was sharing with her, and it led to me sleeping in my student car at the time, which was a Renault Clio, a blue Renault Clio that I would park on Russell Square. This was during the time of my final exams, because of course I went to Egypt for my third year, for my language year, which is the gap year, because I was doing Arabic and law. I had my final law degree, my final year for law to complete. And so during the period of my final exams, I had left home, but I had to stay near SOAS because I had to go in for my exams. I was 28 at this time, an undergraduate with rubbish career prospects, because of course who's going to want to employ someone who's been convicted in the war on terror? So you know, my self-esteem was right down there. And of course
Did you actually put it on your CV?
You know, the truth is I did.
Convicted.
I'm not even saying I actually did. Because the very next job I got was with McCormack's law firm doing terrorism defense. So the 21/7 case, if anyone remembers the copycat case for the 7/7 bombers, there was a 21/7 copycat case involving a Ghanaian called Manfo Kwakio Asiedo. I was on his defense team. I met him a number of occasions inside Belmarsh, Cat AA, Cat AAA, I think. Including Salahuddin Amin, who was in the fertilizer bomb plot. These were the people I was interviewing for terrorism defense before we founded Quilliam. So before that happened, and before I got that job, I was doing my final exams, and it was the lowest ebb in my life, and I had nowhere to stay, but I needed to stay near SOAS for my exams. So what I ended up doing was sleeping in my Renault Clio that was parked on Russell Square, and I had a blanket to keep myself warm. And that blanket is now in my car. I keep it. It's still there. I no longer drive a Renault Clio. Those of you who know me know that I drive a car that I call the Beast, which is a 4x4 Mini, 5-door, soup hop in typical Essex style. With,
still an Essex boy at heart. That's great.
With black matte alloy wheels. But no, the blanket is still in the boot. And I keep that blanket because it reminds me of the lowest point I ever got to. I was jobless. My marriage had just broken up. I didn't have a degree to my name. And I didn't know where to go next. And the significance of Russell Square is that that's where we then founded Quilliam. So Quilliam and our offices are in that same area. We launched in the British Museum, which is in that area. And I've kept everything in that area because of the significance of Russell Square in my own life.
I didn't realise that. Mehdi Hassan, answer that question.
Yes.
And then we're going to go out to a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sure you must be bursting at this point. I'm so apologies.
So this week's New Statesman carries a debate between Mehdi Hassan, who used to be their political editor. He's just left them to join Huffington Post UK as their head of politics for HuffPo UK. He and I have debated in the New Statesman this week. It's current, it's in the shops, and it's also online. And the debate was the causes of extremism. Mehdi, being a left-wing commentator, believes that the causes of extremism are grievances. Now, of course, I'm no stranger to grievances, but I disagree with that narrative. I actually, in fact, disagree with both the left and the right-wing narratives. Before Quilliam came along, and in fact, before many other counter-extremism initiatives were mushroomed in the UK, and the UK, I think, is at the lead, at the forefront of such initiatives, thankfully. But before this happened, and before those initiatives mushroomed, the debate was polarized in two forms. There's what I call the left-wing polarization and the right-wing polarization. The left-wing polarization was to pretend there's no such thing. I'm caricaturing a stance. I call it the regressive left, because I think it's incredibly regressive of those who claim themselves to be left-wing to turn a blind eye to Islamist bigotry. But anyway, we can get to that in the Q&A. But the caricature of the left-wing stance was to bury one's head in the sand, pretend that anything a brown person says must be by definition resistance, because of course, you know, we're brown, and actually blame the white man's burden, blame foreign policy for everything. Now, of course, I have done, and there's a story in the book you'll remember about the Iraq War and me using the Stop the War coalition against the Iraq War as a tool in prison to convince a terrorist not to bomb Britain. And you have to read the story to see how that turned out. A trained professional bomb maker was convicted to 17 years in prison, and we have a dialogue about why he mustn't bomb Britain. So that's in the book. But I've always opposed the Iraq War, but the narrative, the explanation that only grievances cause extremism and terrorism is only part of the story. It's not the full picture.
In some ways, it's dehumanizing for the people involved, right? You're like, you too must be passive to sort of just being a person who is always aggrieved.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a strange thing.
It's reverse racism, because it's what we call the poverty of expectation. It's to say that whatever comes from brown culture, even if it's extremely bigoted, it's indigenous and authentic, so it must be encouraged. That's a form of reverse racism. It's like, bring me your leader, where is your chief? Burn your wife on the stake and I will celebrate you. No, the Taliban 2 days ago executed a woman because they accused her of adultery. That's barbaric, and that must be condemned whether the person doing it is white or brown. And that's the point, that the left-wing narrative that basically it's all about colonialism and foreign policy, the way to, and you know, you can see I feel very passionate about this because I've obviously lived through all this experience, but the way to challenge it is to say, look, the Taliban who took over the northern parts of Pakistan, known as Swat, when they took over this region, what did US drone strikes and foreign policy have to do with them forcing men to grow their beards and lashing women for not covering their hairs, covering their head? What's the link? What's US foreign policy got to do with forcing me not to shave? And that's enough to demonstrate that there's something more than just grievances. But having said all of that, I also now want to lay into a bit that what I call the neocon narrative, because it's just as bad. The narrative that it's all about basically Muslims. Wherever Muslims are, this is the right-wing caricature now, yeah? Wherever Muslims exist, they're attempting to take over. They are inherently supremacist. Islam is an inherently supremacist ideology, and the Eurabia conspiracy theory, that the presence of Muslims in Europe necessarily means they're attempting to take over, and therefore we must stop Muslim immigration. And as one right-wing commentator previously said, I won't mention his name, but he said, quote, conditions must be made harder for Muslims across Europe. And if any Muslim incites violence against British troops, even if they're born in Europe, this is all a quote, yeah, they must be forcibly expelled to their country of their parents.
Why don't you want to name him? Isn't that Douglas Murray?
Well, so...
he's on record. He's quite, you know...
because I'm not sure if he's retracted the comment, and I can't imagine anyone not retracting such a bigoted comments. So,
well, you'd be surprised.
So the point is that there's that right wing, the opposite of the reverse racism, poverty of expectation, absurdity that is leftists sort of burying their heads in the sand concept is the right wing neocon model, which is blaming Islam and Muslims for everything. Now you may wonder then what does that leave? Well, what it leaves is, as I've said in the New Statesman debate, the idea that human beings are not water. We don't all boil at 100 degrees Celsius. That's the point. There is no scientific explanation for the causes of radicalization. There are general principles we can adopt. Those general principles are four. And academia is pretty much settling on this. My story brings them out vividly without turning it into an academic debate. But the general principles are, and it can be in any order, in any level of intensity, but it generally requires these four to exist. Grievances, whether real or perceived, because of course, for the aggrieved party, if he perceives a grievance, it's sufficient to make him angry. So whether real or perceived. Grievances, an identity crisis, and as you've heard now, we were discussing identities, why it's so relevant. That's number two. Number three, a charismatic recruiter that's able to string together these grievances and these identity crises in a way that makes sense. And number four, an ideological narrative. Now, that ideological narrative is crucial because without that ideological narrative, the 7/7 bombers wouldn't have said, in their thick Yorkshire accents, by the way, that your people have attacked my people. Here's a British Pakistani talking about Iraqis as his people in a Yorkshire accent and saying that British people are not his people. So the recalibration of identity that is required to do that and then to blow up one's own citizens is what I call the ideological narrative. It's the politicization of the religious identity, what we spoke about earlier, to say that you are exclusively Muslim in politics and nothing else, which means that everyone else isn't of your people. Your people are exclusively and only Muslims. If a Muslim suffers in Iraq at the hands of any non-Muslim anywhere else, then all non-Muslims are responsible for that suffering and all Muslims are responsible for alleviating that suffering. That's the politicization of the Muslim identity and the politicization of the Ummah concept. And that's the ideological narrative. So all four of these are necessary, and it's not one or the other, and they can mix in any particular order. And all four, in terms of policy remedies, we need to address all four. We need to address grievances on the one hand, but we also need to challenge the narrative. And those on the left, sorry, I'll shut up now in a minute.
Only to give them
those on the left.
The audience a question.
Those on the left need to learn a lesson. If they're happy to challenge racism as an idea, they should be happy to challenge Islamism as an idea. And those on the right need to learn a lesson. If they want to basically deny the role of grievances when it comes to people getting angry, then don't talk about white working class grievances and getting angry that leads to sort of anti-immigration sentiment and losing our jobs. These are all grievances as well. Don't talk about that either. If you push them for consistency, you'll find that both arguments fall apart. And that's where I'll stop. And that was the Quilliam pitch, by the way.
I was going to say that was the Quilliam pitch. So he was doing it. The gentleman at the back, do you still have a question? I don't know whether you had one because you had your hand up before. No? Yes?
Yeah. I'm just interested in your transition from Islamist to anti-Islamist. And obviously, you've said it happened while you were in an Egyptian prison and you were tortured. I don't know if there's a direct parallel or not. And a sort of follow-up question would be, do you think there's anything that a state that does respect human rights, a state can do to affect that transition in people? For example, could the British government do anything, or does it have to happen sort of through people's own volition and, slightly more random influences, reading your book or whatever it might be?
Okay, so
I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll have two.
How long do we have, by the way? How long do we have?
I think we've got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
About 10
I'll try and
minutes
keep my answers very short then, because
there's the lady there who had her hand up. Yeah.
It was exactly the same.
Oh, it's exactly the same. Excellent. Then the gentleman over here.
I was going to ask if you could describe remembering 9/11 at that point in your life where you were, just what your sort of instinctual gut reaction was to it.
Okay.
That's in the book. So the first question, basically, two things happened in prison that allowed me to begin changing my views. One is what I call the rehumanization process, and it's in a chapter that's headed "Where the Heart Leads, the Mind Can Follow." And that's that Amnesty International adopted me as a prisoner of conscience. Because, of course, remember, Hizb al-Tahrir was not a terrorist organization. So we were imprisoned for having and believing in extremist, but nevertheless non-terrorist ideas. So Amnesty's adoption of our case as prisoners of conscience had a profound impact on me, because it was the first time that I began seeing the human rights discourse being applied consistently to people who we considered Amnesty our enemy. And so that really had an impact on me, and that began the process of the emotional reconciliation, first of all. But then that wasn't sufficient. The second thing that needed to happen was the intellectual transformation, and that came through me studying in detail from the original Islamic sources, in the original language of Arabic, the Quran and the explanation of the Quran and the Hadith, and studying with qualified theologians, and being able to eventually differentiate between Islam as a religion and Islamism as I've defined it, the desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society by law. And the intellectual unraveling happened over a course of 5 years, 4 years in prison and 1 year after prison. And that's in answer to your question. And I don't want to talk for too long, so in answer to your question, there's a chapter called The Polemic in the book. And actually it's 1.5 pages of me talking about, it's a rant, and it's my reflections on 9/11 when I was with HT and what my knee-jerk response was.
It's very interesting. It's definitely, it's brilliant. It's a very powerful thing, obviously. And to watch then, therefore, you move from that. Yeah. Lady over here.
Hello, my name is Jamisha. I am studying terrorism security at King's College, and I write for therisky.com. You've discussed the 4 sort of facets of radicalization, charismatic leaders, narrative, ideology, grievance, and so on, or grievance perception. I'd be interested to know your views on the permutations of the prevent strategy and sort of the utility of this Britishness debate, and how useful integration is if identity isn't the only aspect of radicalism.
Well, it isn't, but also identity isn't the only remedy proposed by the prevent strategy. So prevent has been split, and the OSCT, the Office for Security and Counterterrorism at the Home Office, is doing the hard-end counterterrorism. But on the other side, communities and local government, the department there in the Home Office, is addressing the integration debate and also the political participation side of it, and the need to encourage more active engagement. So I think prevent is attempting to address the various strands of this debate. There is much room for improvement. I'm happy they split the two. I think one of the areas that they need to improve on is in delivery. CLG specifically needs to start delivering. But of course, that's another huge discussion, and I want to encourage more questions. Okay. On the policy question at the back as well, I forgot to answer. Again, forgive me, because I really want to get more questions out, but that, in a sense, that's what we do professionally every day anyway, so feel free to write into us at Quilliam.
1 and 2, and then, and can someone ask him about why he's joined the Lib Dems, please? 1 and 2, yes.
Well, actually, as much as I enjoyed listening to you, and I appreciate it, but in reply to the question the gentleman asked regarding whether the government is responsible of creating a shift or the people, I believe that it is the people like Maajid, like Ed, like myself, like others. And for the first time, I'd like to announce that we are having a new organization called Basira, which stands for British Arab Supports Integration, Recognition, and Awareness. You can check it on the website, and by all means, if you have anything, it's going to be very interesting, unusual, because it's not going to be lectures, it's going to be films, and through films with subtitles, we are going to show human rights violations in the area and address it as to how privileged we are in this secular society. Thank you.
Cheeky plug, but I like it. Okay, and the lady over there.
Hi, my name's Cindy Maceda. I'm also brown, but I'm actually from the Philippines, where we have an Islamic insurgency. We were the original white man's burden, by the way, the Filipinos, according to Rudyard Kipling. I'm here because I'm very interested in what you're saying. I hope that your book is translated into French. My stepdaughter is French, and she converted to Muslim religion when she was 15. She's married to Tunisian. I'm not saying that they're Islamists or radical or anything like that, but they absolutely believed. This survey came out in France about a year or two ago that the most practiced religion in France now is Islam. And it's only a matter of time that France will become an Islamic country by virtue of the fact that they have more children than anybody who has any titular religion. What are your thoughts about that?
There's a group, there's a statistics debate, and there's a group, the Eurabia pressure group type people, who claim that Muslims are reproducing at a higher birth rate than everybody else in Europe. And so by 2050, Muslims will be in the majority in Europe and will end up, therefore, enforcing Sharia. So there are people that believe that. There are people that believe that they need to enforce Sharia and interpretation of Sharia in Europe. I think the debates are red herring. I suspect the statistics are dodgy. I've looked into it somewhat, and the statistics don't necessarily stand up. I think what's more important isn't the faith, denomination, or lack of any citizen in Europe. I think what's more important are the political values that any citizen believes in. You can be a Muslim and be a Liberal Democrat. You can be a Muslim and be a member of the Labour Party and be a member of the Conservative Party or any other party across Europe and still be devout. I'm not a religious role model. I don't call myself devout, but I know there are many devout Muslims in each one of these three political parties. There's absolutely no contradiction between being devout and being in one of these three political parties. So what that tells us is what's more important than the individual faith of any European Muslim citizen are their political values. And that means that we need to start working, and I end the book on this actually with the idea of what I call radical democratic activism. Now the title of this book is actually quite misleading because the word radical I'm using in this book not to describe my Islamist phase. Section 2 of the book, my Islamist phase, is called Islamist. Section 3 is called radical, and that's describing me now because I'm trying to reclaim the word and say that what's truly radical in Muslim majority societies is to advocate democratic culture on the grassroots. And it's called what I call the democratic trinity. Democratic culture, meaning the values that underpin democracy, human rights and other such values. 2, the democratic institutions, parliament and what have you. And 3, the democratic processes. If these 3, the democratic trinity, can be entrenched in the grassroots in Muslim majority societies, or in the example you mentioned, across Europe for the young people of Europe, then we can secure the future, for the democratic future. And in that, I'd just like to mention that, in fact, we founded a movement to do that in Pakistan called Khudi. We're attempting to actually advocate the democratic trinity on the grassroots in Pakistan, and a leadership member of Khudi called Imran Khan is here. He's actually just come from Pakistan to spend the week with me, and so you can speak to him about the efforts there as well. But what's more important are the political values and not the individual faith of any one given person.
No, you can't. For the moment, because we've got a lady over here on the left who would like to ask a question too.
Yes, in this discord there are the political issues, but interfaith issues go beyond Islam. It involves all the faiths, and there's a lot of work being done to bring about more harmony between the faiths. How does that affect your whole approach?
Yeah. Interfaith it must continue, and that's on the integration side of the debate, and it must continue. But it's different to addressing Islamism, and the two objectives we must understand the different things. What interfaith does is it takes people who are already religious and gets them to start having a conversation with each other. What we're attempting to do is, as well as that, we're attempting to engage the young, angry British Muslims with counter-narratives. Those young, angry Muslims aren't engaged in faith, let alone interfaith. Most people that join Islamist organizations don't come from a faith background. They're people like me who weren't particularly religious and then get politicized. There's a sentence I use in the book that mine was a political revolution with religious connotations rather than a religious revolution with political connotations. And I think that the idea to challenge Islamism is to actually reach those types of people, not the priests and the imams who are and have been for a long time engaging in interfaith, though that must continue as well.
Okay, I think it's probably time to wrap up now. So people leaving, you see, and then the books won't get sold. So I'd implore you to buy it. It's wonderful. We didn't get to find out why he joined the Lib Dems. Clearly, you're going to have to buy the book now, definitely to find out the answer for that, or harass him afterwards while he's signing your book. Because I presume you'll be signing them over there, will you?
Well, if anyone buys a book, I'll sign it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I certainly did. Could we get a round of applause for Maajid?
Thank you.